Good evening, ladies and gentlemen in Facebook world. Thank you for being on my ninth episode of Live with Gregory Pappas. It is 7 p.m. in New York City, and any minute now you might even be able to hear the nightly thank you that goes on here in the city as people hang out their windows and bang their pots and pans, thanking the healthcare first responders. And there it goes. You probably can't hear it because I have my windows closed, but it's something that happens here every night. Tonight is a very special night for us in the Greek world primarily. We are commemorating, remembering a very somber event in the history of the modern Greek nation. Today, around the world, Pontian Greeks are I hate to use the word celebrating because it isn't a celebration, but in a way it is, and I'll explain my reasoning for that. It is a celebration of the anniversary of the genocide of the Pontian Greeks. Why do I call it a celebration? It's a commemoration, obviously, but it's a celebration because for me, 101 years ago, a man named Ataturk had one goal in mind, and that was to wipe out the entire Christian population of Asia Minor, of Turkey. He was building a Turkey for the Turks, and the Pontian Greeks were amongst his first targets, along with the Armenians. Today, I'm very fortunate to know many people of Pontian heritage. I've got my great friends in Ohio, the Tirambilis family, and their wonderful kids. I've got so many friends in Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know if Sandy Papadopoulos is watching, but I know Pontians all around the world who are ferociously proud of their heritage, of their history, and to sit and watch a fourth or fifth generation young person of Pontian heritage celebrate a heritage of his or her great grandfather. It's astounding. These people were not supposed to be here anymore. The Turks tried to systematically wipe them out. Hundreds and thousands of Pontian Greeks and Greeks all over Asia Minor, which we will talk about tonight with my guest, were the target of this genocide that historically began in the early 1900s as Ataturk went on his rampage, wiping out entire villages, entire cities, burning cities to the ground, massacring entire populations. The Pontians suffered greatly. There is an event happening tonight that I also wanted to tell you about. It's the Pan-Pontian Federation of USA and Canada will be having a live stream event on their Facebook page. I will be posting the link here on the comments section, and they'll be having speakers and events commemorating the genocide. I hesitate to call it a Pontian genocide, and that's one of the reasons why I brought my next author, my next guest with me. In my opinion, and historically speaking, I think this was a single act, a single genocide that took place of the entire Christian population of Asia Minor. I believe it began in the early 1900s. We saw events in Thrace, we saw events all around Asia Minor, and they culminated on the docks in Smyrna. They culminated in September of 1922 in that remarkable city, that multicultural city, that jewel of the Mediterranean called Smyrna. And my guest tonight is Lou Ureneck, who is one of the world's foremost experts, historians on the subject. He has written a remarkable book. Lou, I'm going to bring you in. I believe you will be online in 1 second. There you are, Lou. Can you see me and hear me?
I can, Greg. It's good to be with you.
Thank you for being here. You're in Maine, right?
I'm in Boston today.
You're in Boston. What's it like up there? How are you doing?
Yeah, we're doing well. You know, we're waiting for the virus to go away, like everybody else. We're just beginning phase one here in Boston. Still lots of restrictions. We go outside with a mask, maintain our social distancing, and like everyone else, we're suffering cabin fever.
Of course, of course. So, Lou, before we start talking, I just want to talk a little bit about your background. You're a retired Boston University professor. You've taught numerous courses in business and economics journalism. I understand you've written 3 books and you're writing a 4th right now.
That's right, yes.
I've seen your work in the New York Times, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the International Herald Tribune, and the Boston Globe. Harvard's Neiman Reports has published you. You're a quite accomplished author, journalist, and I'm very honored to have you. I'd love to talk about everything, but we don't have a lot of time, and I think everybody watching tonight is very interested to hear mostly about your book. And I do want to clarify some things because the book was originally called The Great Fire. There's still some copies circulating on Amazon, and I'm posting the links right now so that people can find the book. So there are hard copies and soft cover copies of the book circulating called The Great Fire. And then we changed the title to Smyrna, September 1922. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, but here's the book in paperback. And I noticed just before we went on, I looked at Amazon and I see that the book is sold out on Amazon, but it can be ordered through Barnes and Noble. Barnes and Noble has has a website, and like Amazon, you can order the book and have it delivered through the mail for free.
Great.
So the best place to get the paperback Smyrna September 1923 was through Barnes and Noble. Amazon and Barnes and Noble is now offering an audio version of the book as well, and the book is also available in Greek if you want to purchase it in Athens, in Greece.
That's wonderful. So the audio book is done, from what I understand, from a pretty well-known actor who read the book. I listened to a sampling of it when you sent it to me.
Great. Yeah, he has a great voice.
He sure does. Lou, lots of questions for you tonight. It's going to be a typical Greg Pappas scatterbrain conversation. We're going to be all over the place. But what brought you to Smyrna?
Initially, I was interested in the story of an American minister named Asa Jennings, who played an important part in the rescue of Greek refugees, Greek and Armenian refugees at Smyrna. And I had planned on researching and writing a thin biography of Asa Jennings. But I got so interested in the story, I went from doing really painting a miniature to conceiving of a mural, and ended up with a much bigger and broader book that took a look at what was happening in Asia Minor through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, culminating in the events at Smyrna in September of 1922. So initially Asa Jennings, but then more broadly an interest in the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of the nationalist Turks, and then the exodus of the Greeks from Asia Minor.
So we're going to definitely talk about Asa Jennings more a little bit later, but I want to start by painting this historical context of what I said earlier. Your book tells a story about events that happened in September of 1922. Today is the commemoration of the Pontian genocide. 353 odd thousand people were massacred. Can you connect these events historically and explain to us why we should be looking at this as a single act perpetrated by the nationalist Turks and not as these mini little genocides? And is the Armenian genocide, is this one big genocide that took place?
It is, Greg, and it's a genocide that lasted about 10 years, and I bracket it from 1912 to 1922. And it's a genocide that was targeted at all Christians in Asia Minor, and that was, the Greeks, who lived in really 3 different parts of Turkey, and I can talk more about that later, the Armenians, as well as the Assyrians. And the genocide occurred in the context of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. It actually preceded Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And it has its roots in the paranoia that seized the Ottoman leadership in the early part of the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire was dissolving. It was losing territory in Europe and in Africa, in the Aegean. There was the rise of Serbia, of Greece, of Bulgaria. The Ottomans had gone to war with the Italians and had lost territory. And there was this fear among the Ottoman elite that the empire was dissolving, but that it was also challenged from within by its Christian minority. And it's important to remember that in those early years, late 19th, early 20th century, 1 in 5 people in Asia Minor was a Christian. There were a lot of Greeks and Armenians in Anatolia. So initially, the rage, let's call it that, against the Greeks and the Armenians came from the Ottoman elite as it tried to first cast blame on the Christians for undermining the Ottoman estate. Okay, and so there was anger, not unlike what we saw in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. In Germany, the scapegoated population was the Jews.
Mhm.
In 1912 through 1922, the scapegoated population for all of the problems occurring in Anatolia were the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians. Um, in 1912 and in 1913, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Turkey fought 2 wars, the so-called Balkan Wars. And in both cases, Turkey was the loser. And it lost a lot of territory. It lost Salonika, which had previously been an Ottoman city. And even before the Balkan Wars, it had lost Crete. So Turkey was feeling besieged, and it looked to the Christians as a way to explain what was happening inside their empire. The Christians were seen as a kind of a fifth column, a traitorous group of people inside Turkey. So the killings, the massacres, and the marches and so forth that we're familiar with began about 1912 and continued right up through the war. In fact, they accelerated during the war, and then after the war, when the Allies prevailed in World War I, the killings continued largely as a consequence of the inability of the Allies to enforce the peace that they had negotiated, the so-called Treaty of Severus. And what's interesting, this is one of the ironies of history. This date, May 19th, which has been selected as the date on which we commemorate the Pontic genocide, uh, it's a date really sort of plucked from history in the sense that's the date that Mustafa Kemal arrived. He landed in the city of Samsun. He traveled surreptitiously from Constantinople to Samsun. And he was there. He was supposed to be inspecting the the Turkish um, conformity to the rules that had been laid down in the treaty. But he really went there to organize a nationalist army in 1919. Um, Interestingly, that same May 1919, he landed in May 19, 1919, in Samsun. On May 15, 1919, the Greeks landed in the city of Smyrna and occupied the city of Smyrna. And it was these two events, really, the rise of this charismatic, ruthless leader, Mustafa Kemal, on one hand, and then the occupation of Smyrna by the Greeks on the other. The Greeks arrived in Smyrna really at the request of the Allies in order to protect the city against a couple of things, against Turkish slaughter of Christians, and also against the Italians who were trying to seize the city of Smyrna as well. But in any event, these two forces clashed, and we know how that ended. That ended very badly for the Greeks. The Greeks, after fighting for 3 years, were defeated in 1922, and they ultimately were forced out of Asia Minor. But the key thing here to remember is that over the course of three Turkish governments, first the Ottoman Empire, then the Young Turks, and then the nationalists under Mustafa Kemal, they were all engaged in killing Christians in order to homogenize their population. They wanted an Islamic nation, a Turkey for the Turks, okay? And so while we often speak of the Armenian genocide, and for sure there was an Armenian genocide, and we speak of the Pontic genocide, and we speak of the so-called Aegean genocide, it's one historical wave that swept over Asia Minor in response to what was happening inside the three successive Turkish governments.
And
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
were these governments connected in any way? I mean, can you explain how did it become policy in three successive Turkish governments?
Right. The governments were not connected, but the common denominator among all of them was this sense of a loss of empire. The Ottoman Empire, going back centuries, had been a very big, powerful, and glorious empire. But by the end of the 19th century, it was the so-called sick man of Europe. And, and those people who led Turkey in those years um, regretted, they were nostalgic for the past. And so the common denominator was let's find a reason for what's happened. And in each case, the reason came down to the Christian population. Now, there were stirrings among the Armenians and the Greeks for not necessarily a separate nation, um, though there was some of that as well. Um, but there was certainly nothing on the scale that would justify, explain the kind of measures that the Turkish governments took in terms of killing women and children and civilians. It was a very brutal genocide. People were not only shot, they were marched to their deaths, they were burned alive in buildings, they were set out, and they died from exposure. It was a horrible thing that happened. And by the end of the 10 years, about 2 million Christians in Asia Minor had been killed in this genocide.
Lou, can you? I know you've traveled the world doing research for this. I read somewhere that you actually retraced the steps of a division coming from the Anatolian. You've been Washington National Archives. You walked the docks in modern day Izmir. You've been in Greece, all over the place. Can you take us to the docks of Smyrna in 1922 and
Sure.
describe, before we start talking about Asa Jennings and the protagonist of your book, what was going on then? What can you give our audience? And by the way, we've got hundreds of people online right now. We're getting a lot of positive comments. If you do have questions out there in Facebook world, please feel free to put them in the comments, and I'll do my best to share them. But Lou, can you take us to Smyrna 1922 for a moment?
Yeah, Smyrna was an extraordinary city. It may have been the richest city in the Mediterranean, and it was rich by virtue of its exports. It was really the principal port of export for all of the carpets leaving Asia. It was rich from its agricultural products, the Smyrna fig. It was rich by virtue of its tobacco. There would not have been an American tobacco industry without the tobacco that was shipped from Smyrna. So it was a very rich city, and it was a city that was very cosmopolitan. The Smyrnians made a lot of money, and they spent a lot of money. They built cultural institutions, opera houses, many theaters, fine private clubs, and so forth. So it was a city that was composed of several populations that more or less lived in harmony. There was a Turkish population, a Greek population, an Armenian population, and then kind of a resident European population that had been there for about 3 centuries. And Smyrna, while there had been some friction among the various groups, it was very, very different than the rest of the empire. The Greeks spoke Turkish. The Turkish told their jokes in Greek. Everybody spoke a little bit of French. The Greeks and the Armenians did business together. It was that kind of a city, really quite extraordinary. So, again, another irony of history is that the final violent catastrophe, the end of this genocide that lasted 10 years, occurred in the city of Smyrna. And of course, the reason for that is that was the principal city that was held by the Greeks beginning in 1919, following the war. And it was the city to which the Greek army retreated after it was defeated in the interior of Turkey.
So, what was going on by September? Now the country.
Okay. So on September 9, the Turkish army entered the city of Smyrna. And the first soldiers in was a detachment of cavalry, and by and large it was an occupying army, and by and large it was peaceful for the first 12 hours that it was in the city. It was under control. It came into the city, it marched along the so-called Quay, which is the waterfront promenade in Smyrna, which is still there, by the way, and it marched to the Konak, the government center of the city of Smyrna. But in the next 12 to 24 hours, the balance of the Turkish army, the infantry, a lot of the poor, underfed, poorly paid, propagandized soldiers that constituted the mass of the Turkish nationalist army began coming into the city. It turned violent. It became very ugly very, very quickly. Uh, the first part of the city that the Turkish army turned on was the Armenian quarter, which was at the back of the city. The Armenian population was relatively small compared to the Greek population in Smyrna, but it was an important population. It was wealthy. It was learned. It was an important. Whoop, I've dropped my phone here. I'm sorry. It was an important part of Armenian culture. So the Turkish army turned on the Armenian quarter and began dragging people out of their homes, raping women, killing all members of the family. It was a really horrible um, 24 to 48 hours. And the Turkish command made no effort to stop this violence and chaos on the part of the Turkish infantry. Very soon, the army had turned on the entire Christian population, and that included the Greeks. So nobody who was a Christian was safe in Smyrna beginning, let's say, September 10 and 11. On September 13, um, the Turkish army, in an attempt, one speculates, none of us know for sure. We know that the Turkish army set fires. We don't really know exactly why, but they set fire to an Armenian American school at the back of the city. We have eyewitnesses, neutral eyewitnesses, Americans and others, who saw the army setting the fires. And unluckily, there was a very strong wind coming out of the south and blowing north, which is unusual for Smyrna in September. And that wind drove the fire across the city. The city was made up largely of wood and masonry homes, and they caught fire very quickly. And, inside of, let's say, 8 to 10 hours, the entire city, well, 90% of the city was on fire, and drove all of the people who were living in the city to the quay, this narrow promenade along Smyrna Harbor. Now, in addition to the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people, Christians who lived in Smyrna, there were about 250,000 at least refugees from the interior of Turkey that had fled ahead of the Turkish army and sought refuge in Smyrna. So they were also caught in this fire. Um, Everybody, let's say 500,000 people, were trapped on this narrow quay, this promenade that about a half a mile long at Smyrna Harbor. The fire went right down to the waterfront, and it was so hot that the ships, the Allied ships that were in the harbor at the time, had to back away because their canvas and their ropes and so forth had started to catch fire. Fire was so hot that women were putting their babies into the water so that they wouldn't literally roast alive. People were committing suicide. Many of the poor people had brought their animals into the city: horses, water buffalo, donkeys, and so forth. These animals panicked and they stampeded the city, the quay. And so people were crushed by animals. The crowd was so tightly packed together that many people died of asphyxiation. And this is the fire that we speak of at Smyrna. It began on September 13 and it burned for almost 4 days. And when it was out, about 90 to 95% of the city was destroyed. And hundreds of thousands of people were left as refugees on the Smyrna Quay. There was no water. All of the water pipes had melted. The food had been taken by the Turkish army. Of course, there were no sanitary conditions to speak of. So it was a dreadful situation, and the people couldn't escape. The Turkish army maintained machine gun posts on either side of the quay, and so people were trapped there. It was a completely hopeless situation. Now, interestingly, the entire world was watching this. The events at Smyrna, the events throughout Turkey, but especially in Smyrna in those days in September, were the lead stories in all of the major newspapers and many small newspapers throughout the world: the New York Times, the Times of London, etc. The world was watching what was happening at Smyrna, and was aghast at what was happening. People were dying like flies. It was just a horrible situation, but it was a hopeless situation. The Allied powers and the United States had made a decision not to get involved. They maintained a policy of strict neutrality. And so there was no attempt, with a small exception of the British Navy on the night of September 13, when about 2,000 people were rescued. There was really no attempt to try to save people who were caught in this fire, in this hell on the Smyrna waterfront. And that's where the situation remained for about a week, and with people dying, hopeless situation. And then ultimately, two Americans came up with a plan, and they worked with a Greek admiral who was at Mytilene, and they took a lot of chances. It was a very crafty diplomatic maneuver, as well as a very risky military maneuver. Um, and the people participating were the Asa Jennings, the Methodist minister who I mentioned earlier, an American naval commander named Halsey Powell, and then a Greek admiral at Lesbos, um, named Theophanides, Yanis Theophanides. And the three of them put together a plan, and they ended up forming a rescue fleet, and were able to take many hundreds of thousands of people out of the city of Smyrna. Are you still there? I don't see you.
Yeah, we just got disconnected, but I think we're back
Okay.
online now. Are we back online?
Okay.
Yes.
So these three individuals put together an incredible rescue, which is not very well known, and saved the lives of at least 250,000 people. Now, interestingly, Smyrna was only one city where, the Greeks and others had fled the Turkish army and were trapped on waterfronts all along the Aegean coast as well as the Black Sea coast. After the evacuation of Smyrna, Asa Jennings and Halsey Powell continued their work, first along the southern coast of Turkey, um, along the Aegean coast, rescuing people using Greek merchant ships and U.S. Destroyers. And then later, beginning in, let's say, late October and November, they began rescuing Christians, largely Greeks, Pontic Greeks, along the Black Sea coast. And they brought many of them first to Constantinople, where many were disembarked. And that was a terrible scene. There was lots of disease and suffering and so forth. And then eventually to some of the Greek islands and Piraeus. Um, by the end of 1922, the beginning of 1923, the patriarch in Constantinople credited the rescue effort with saving the lives of about 1 million Greeks. So it was an extraordinary effort. And it was the end, really, of this 10-year genocide. And then the Greek and Turkish governments negotiated a population exchange, which by then was largely accomplished by virtue of what had happened militarily.
One of the things that struck me when I read the book, and in some of the headlines that I've seen about the book, I mean, there was one I think I saw in a Boston newspaper or a university newspaper that interviewed you that called Jennings a failed minister. I mean,
Right.
talk about a man rising to the occasion. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about this guy and why he was
Right.
the last person in the city that we would have expected to pull off this heroic feat?
He was an extraordinary character, and as you say, the person you would at least expect to do this. First, he was a small man, and he was very sickly. He had suffered a series of illnesses in his 20s and 30s that left him with a hunchback, with a shortness of breath, with constant pain, and so forth. But he was a cheerful guy and a very positive person. He happened to be in Smyrna as an employee of the YMCA. In fact, he had only arrived in August, 2 weeks before these events, a time when even then everybody was on vacation. And right, amazingly. And so, he witnessed first the entrance of the Turkish army into the city. He witnessed the fires and so forth. And when the Americans and others were evacuated, there were many Americans living in Smyrna at the time, working for tobacco companies and so forth, teaching at international college. When all of these Americans were evacuated onto American destroyers, Jennings decided to stay behind. And initially, what he did is he seized a series of mansions along the waterfront. They had been occupied by rich Greeks and Armenians, but they had left the city. He seized them and he used them as first aid stations for women primarily. Rape was very much a weapon of war employed by the Turkish army. So there were many women who had been raped, terribly beaten, and Jennings went around the city collecting them and brought them to these various safe houses. He was attending to one of these safe houses in the end of the second week, let's say, toward the beginning of the third week of September, when he hatched his plan to try to rescue people. And it began really with an Italian freighter that he spotted in the harbor. And he negotiated with the captain of that Italian freighter. I say negotiated. Actually, what he did is he paid a pretty significant bribe with money from Near East Relief, the American organization. And that Italian freighter removed 2,000 people from his safe houses and brought them to Mytilene. Jennings was able to do that with the assistance of a U.S. naval commander uh, who really was acting against orders. Had it been learned that he was doing this, because there was this explicit policy of neutrality, he could have been reprimanded. Maybe he would have lost his rank. His name was Halsey Powell. He's a very accomplished and a principled naval officer. So Jennings brought these 2,000 people on the Italian freighter to Mytilene, and while he was at Mytilene, he saw many of the Greek merchant ships that had been used to evacuate the Greek army. And he decided he was going to try to get possession of those ships in order to evacuate more Greeks from Smyrna. And he did that really through some duplicity. through some bravado with the assistance of Halsey Powell. And let's say it was, I think, September 21, if I recall my days correctly, that Jennings was on the lead merchant ship. There was a long line of Greek merchant ships that were steaming towards Smyrna Harbor. Halsey Powell, the American commander, had gotten the permission of the Turkish army to evacuate women and children on Greek ships if they didn't fly Greek flags.
Hmm.
Um, so Powell Jennings led these ships to Smyrna. Powell sent a destroyer escort and brought the freighters into these merchant ships into the city of Smyrna. And the Turkish army gave Powell and Jennings 7 days to evacuate all of the women and children, which seemed to everybody to be an impossibility.
Sure.
There was no infrastructure for this. The Turkish army made it very difficult. They formed a single line. Everybody had to be searched for documents, for valuables, and so forth before they were put on a ship. So it seemed an impossibility. But Powell and Jennings ran this rescue operation 24 hours, 7 days a week, ships in, ships out, ships back to Smyrna, and so forth, U.S. escort. And by the end of September, they had done the impossible. They had evacuated, the women and children from Smyrna. Now, the Turkish army didn't let the Greek men, those of military age, and that was, 15 to age 60, let's say, leave the city. Those men were either killed in Smyrna or they were sent to work details inside the interior of Turkey and prison camps, and many of them died. Some were repatriated in 1923, but many tens of thousands of them died in captivity.
Yeah, Lou, this is one of the remarkable stories of not just the modern Greek history, but of history to read about this diminutive man, this as this newspaper called him, this failed minister who
Right.
rose to the occasion to save hundreds of thousands of people. I pulled a quote out of another review of the book, and I'd like to bring this a little bit to the contemporary with this quote. It said here that Jennings was in fact recognized for a brief period in Greece. I think he's got a couple of statues and a couple of roads named after him. But this story fell victim to a State Department campaign to protect the diplomatic and commercial relationship with Turkey. It's a little shocking. It's a little startling to know that such an important part of history. Was it a concerted effort to hide this, to prevent these types of stories from getting out there?
It absolutely was. There was a big debate in the United States, beginning, with the Smyrna events. In fact, the entire genocide. There was a big debate in the United States whether or not the United States should have any kind of diplomatic or commercial relations with Turkey. Um, the opposition was led largely by the religious community in the United States, missionaries who had been there, but the leaders of all of the major churches and synagogues in the United States were appalled at what had happened in Turkey. All of the lives that were lost, all of the blood that was shed, the suffering and so forth. It was just horrible. And there was a moral sense that the United States should not proceed with a relationship with nationalist Turkey. On the other side of the equation, so to speak, were those people who practice what they considered to be realpolitik. Their view was Turkey's a nation. We should do business with it. We should accept the reality of this nation, and we should establish diplomatic relations. We should play a part in the economic development of that country, building its railroads, building its ports, and exploiting oil that it might have, under the ground. This was a period when the nation was looking everywhere for oil. Sound familiar? Uh, so this debate played out, and the State Department was the principal exponent of the pro relationship side, and it played out in the press. There was a lot of disinformation and so forth, and eventually, it took about 8 or 9 years, but eventually was Turkey was recognized by the U.S. and we established both diplomatic and commercial relationships.
Yet this whitewashing of history has continued. It continues to the present day. You've got
Right.
genocide deniers that are funding university seats in our very country. You've
Correct.
people that are pretty much brainwashed to believing that a lot of these events that you personally researched, that you saw in archives, that you read diaries of, they're claiming that these things didn't happen. I do want to go back really quick because we kind of quickly went over the fire itself has been a big bone of contention, but not with anybody that has a brain. I mean, anybody that has a brain either read Marjorie Dobkin's book or your book. I mean, there's real evidence. Do we have any? Because that's the argument that some of my Turkish friends say, well, we don't know. Someone says, I read somewhere that the Greeks set the fire themselves. I mean, there have been some crazy conspiracy theories. Sound familiar? um, do we have any reasonable doubt at all about this fire being set by the Turkish army?
None whatsoever. In fact, right after the fire went out, U.S. naval personnel went ashore and challenged the Turkish army about what had happened. And at that time, the leadership of the Turkish army said the fire was set by a group of Armenians who were conspiring to burn the city. That was the assertion. And they said, additionally, we have them in jail. We have the men who set the fire. So the American naval officers who were present, there was a succession of them, said, produce these witnesses. We want to see them. And the Turkish army was never able to produce these Armenians who were the so-called conspirators. So that was a concocted story that only lasted, for a period of time. So there is no evidence to the contrary. There is positive evidence that the Turkish uh, soldiers did in fact set the fire. Absolutely.
Lou, we're going to be shortly wrapping up here, but because these videos stay online forever, I do want to show a copy of the book here. I am with Professor Lou Ureneck, the author of Smyrna 1922, September 1922, the story of the American mission to rescue victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Very timely topic this evening. We invited Lou to be a part of this conversation because of the global commemorations taking place today for the genocide of the Pontian Greeks. I'm going to be putting a link in the comments about where you can purchase the book. Lou has also informed us that Amazon is sold out. You can get the book at Barnes & Noble. You can also get a copy of the audio book, which has recently been released. Lou, one last question before we go. And this is something that I ask everybody, historians, authors, scholars. Why is an event a century ago relevant to us today? Why are you and I even having this conversation? Why did you write this book almost a century after these events happened? I mean, this is a hot topic. People are arguing about this on Facebook every day. We're still talking about events that happened over a century ago. Why?
I think of that famous quotation from William Faulkner, who said, "The history is not dead. In fact, it's not even past." Um, there are many. First of all, it's an incredibly interesting period of history, and we've only scratched the surface here. But there are many lessons to be learned from what happened in Asia Minor and then ultimately at Smyrna. lessons about individual agency and the ability of one or two people to make a difference when they act with courage and morality. I think that's the story of Asa Jennings um, and others. There's also a history about major powers winning wars but losing pieces. And that's largely what happened in Asia Minor. So there are many, many important lessons for us in 2020 to take away from the events of Anatolia in the first part of the 20th century. It's very much a story that lives.
Lou, thank you very much for your time tonight. I want to remind everybody that the Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States and Canada will be hosting a live event on their Facebook page in about 15 minutes. It's going to be a commemoration event with speakers, from what I understand. I will post the link in the comments. I hope you'll all join me. I want to give a quick shout out once again to my very special Pontian friends in Atlanta, in Connecticut, in Ohio. I've learned so much about the resilience of these people. And it's why I continue to call these events celebrations, because these are celebrations of life. I look at these kids that are third and fourth generation Pontian Greeks. They're not supposed to be dancing at their annual dances. That wasn't part of the plan. Part of the plan was to wipe out their grandparents and great-grandparents, and it's just a fascinating sight for me, especially here in the diaspora in the United States, where not only have these families, uprooted, they survived these horrific events. They were uprooted to Greece. They maintained their culture, their language, their heritage, their history. And then because of wars or World War II or whatever the events were at the time, they left and were scattered in France, in Canada, in Australia, throughout the United States. And here they are 3 and 4 generations later, and the kids are learning how to cook and the kids are learning how to dance. And it's a beautiful testament. So yes, we commemorate the dead, we remember the dead, but we celebrate those living too, because it's truly a testament to the culture, the heritage, and the resilience of our people. So in memory of all of those who perished, not just on the docks of Smyrna, but in Pontos, that we're commemorating these events. A big thank you to people like Lou Ureneck, who spend years on end researching these events and poring over archives. I hope that you will all purchase a copy of Lou's book. It's one of the very important books in my library that I've referred back to. Lou, we featured you on the Pappas Post many times.
Yes, thank you.
Speaking of the Pappas Post, I do want to thank all of you who continue to support our efforts through your monthly contribution. There's a link, pappaspost.com/support. We can't do this without you. It costs money to pay our servers and to pay our security, to keep your website safe, to keep your browsing experience safe. And we don't ask for a lot of money. We ask for people to pitch in $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever they can. There is a link. I will be posting it. I do appreciate all of the support we're getting. We're going to continue having these live feeds. Lou, we're going to let you do a little bit more research, and maybe we'll have you back in September to talk about another chapter of this book. There's some fascinating stories in your book that we did not talk about tonight, people that you met, people that you interviewed. I look forward to having you back, and thank you all for watching. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Thank you, Lou.
Bye.